I'm thrilled to be here tonight at Wintherthur Museum in Newcastle County, Delaware. With me are Kim Collison, Curator of Exhibitions, and Alexandra Deutsch, Director of Collections. Thank you for being here. We are in the galleries adjacent to the 175-room home of Henry Francis DuPont, and one of the world's most foremost collectors of American furniture and decorative arts. The library, just on the other side of us, holds not only the DuPont collections, but over 87,000 books and 800,000 manuscripts. It's a pretty spectacular place. Kim and Alexandra, what is it like to work amongst such a diverse and storied collection?
I would say that for me, I've been here 4 years, and no day is the same, and the range of what we work on is just astonishing. I think with a collection this vast, and I think also a collection that really spans so many centuries, that there's always something surprising in Wintherthur's collection.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the fact that it's just a really lovely place to work, it's a beautiful place to come every day, the collection is filled with stories, and the work we do is uncovering those stories and finding out new things all the time.
That's great. Is there a piece that has surprised you recently? And likewise, is there a story that gives you an interesting story that you've seen recently?
Well, we're always looking at new things. I mean, even just this morning we were talking about a fabulous quilt in the collection, which our Curator of Textiles is doing additional research on that quilt, but trying to understand how the quilt was made, whether it may have been made from bunting even, and who was behind the design of it. And it's really getting at those stories and understanding the makers that is part of our work.
I think what's been really surprising for me is actually the small objects that have yielded these incredible stories. So things that I would never have even thought that I'd be interested in. We had in the galleries a woodworking tool, a molding plane, and it had the name of the owner of it. And it turned out he was formerly enslaved. He eventually is freed by his master. And it's this whole odyssey of just a whole person's universe through this really humble object that if we had not been investigating the stories, we would never have really uncovered how significant this seemingly everyday 18th century object is.
That's pretty fascinating. Obviously, we're in a special institution and one that could have so many directions. Under the leadership of both of you, what is your mission for the museum, the property, the collections?
Well, Wintherthur's Museum really is to build on this vision of Henry Francis DuPont, our founder, with education and inspiration at the center of everything we do, and that includes how we interpret the collection, preservation, teaching, which is a huge part of Wintherthur as an institution, our relationship with the University of Delaware. But really, in sum, it's to educate and inspire with everything that we have.
And I think part of that most recently has really been looking at underrepresented stories, both in our collection and in a case like this, where we are talking about a story that hasn't been told.
Very cool. You talked about the quilt earlier, and we're around some amazing garments. What's the connection with Wintherthur and textiles and fashion exhibitions?
I'll let Kim has been here longer than I have, and she's worked on quite a few costume exhibits here.
Yes, so we have done several costume exhibits in the past. This actually will be our fourth. But to date, all the costume exhibitions here at Wintherthur have focused on costume from television and film. So this is a really unique opportunity to bring historic dress to the galleries. And it really originated with a young woman who was here as a cataloger at Wintherthur, and she had done her graduate work on Ann Lowe. She worked here in our collections department, and her continued research on Lowe inspired everyone in the department until she finally proposed the exhibition. And that's what led to us doing it here today.
Awesome. I understand that you've been working on the collection since 2020. To me, that seems like a long time. And I know we were in the middle of a global pandemic for a while. Couturier talked about that in the creation of the wedding dress recreation. What was that process like over the I guess, 2.5, 3 years?
Well, it really originated way before 2020, but the idea originates with Margaret Powell when she works in the curatorial department. So arguably it goes back to, I guess, as early as maybe 2015.
Yeah, and it was
16.
2018 when we first started talking about the exhibition.
And I think what really became important was figuring out with the other institutions who had Ann Lowe's gowns or her pieces, who was going to really have the ability to mount a show on the scale that Margaret certainly had envisioned. And the Smithsonian has a very large collection at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Met also has a large collection. Margaret Powell had originated the research, was at the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, so there had been a thought of it being there. But what really happened is that Wintherthur had the unique ability of any institution to do all of the treatments on the gowns, whether they were lent from private collections or whether they were lent from institutional collections. And we had this deep connection to Margaret Powell's research. So really the two things combined, I think by 2019 had solidified it. And by January of 2020, thanks in part to the curator at the Carnegie Museum who had worked with Margaret, we were led to Elizabeth Way, who's the associate curator at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, and she was just the perfect person. And when I look back, that was late January of 2020, and then how would we ever have known that, about a month and a half later, we would be in a totally different world. But this show, it was almost a show that wanted to be, because so many pieces fell into place and continue to fall into place even now that it's open, that it allowed us to do it on this scale.
And sadly, Margaret Powell passed away in 2019. This show is dedicated to her, but that's why we had to start working with Liz Way.
One thing that I know that you were able to do with that time and with all your contributors was to create a really immersive and educational experience about it. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Well, now with all of our exhibits, we work closely interdepartmentally, really to build the experience beyond just what's in the galleries. So we definitely knew it was very important for us to use the Ann Lowe exhibition as a platform or a foundation for us to have conversations that were relevant to the fashion industry today, and particularly as it relates to designers of color. And thanks to Kim's efforts, we, in October, will have a 2-day symposium.
Yeah, so October 20th and 21st, two-day symposium with scholars, conservators, Katja Rolsi, who made the dress behind me, and some of our contemporary designers who are featured in the exhibition, as well as some local contemporary designers whose work will be displayed in the museum house.
So even our Yuletide theme will have, although we'll have fan favorite trees, we're going to have trees that are inspired by Ann Lowe gowns, and given her gowns, they're a perfect point of inspiration. So we really are carrying that experience right down to the floral designs that visitors will see throughout the galleries building, into the house. So really every aspect of this, you'll be greeted by this amazing floral gown.
Ann Lowe trees, inspired trees.
Including outside of the galleries. Katja Rolsi is doing an amazing, who did the Jacqueline Kennedy reproduction, is doing an amazing imagining of the Ann Lowe gown that'll be outside the galleries building. So I think one thing that's been really fun for all of us who've been involved, and the many departments who've been involved, is just seeing how a show like this ends up impacting the whole institution, and then it ends up being an experience throughout a visitor's day when they come to the museum. So it's so much more than what is in the gallery.
Sure. Well, let's take an opportunity to go and see some of these inspiring pieces and the efforts of the whole community's work. So when I first visited, one of you described this as the gilded dress, and you chose to do the first piece of the collection for a couple of significant reasons.
Yeah, this dress is really special. Not only is it beautiful, it is an iconic low dress in the sense that it was made for one of these fantasy balls that she was often designing for debutantes, fantasy balls, special occasions for these society women. And this particular dress was designed for a ball called Axar Ben, which is Nebraska spelled backwards. And the woman who wore this dress for that particular ball actually added white underneath the dress and re-wore the dress as a wedding gown a year later. And so that, I think, really captures Lowe's story in a lot of ways. Women loved wearing these dresses, and so much so that they wanted to wear them again. And we have a few in the exhibition that were reworn, repurposed, and altered to do that.
Great. Let's move on to our first case. So, yeah, go ahead. Tell us the significance behind this grouping of garments and why it's kind of a flagship at the beginning of the show.
Well, here you're going from the 1930s to the 1960s. And I think that is what is really striking to people is you're looking at one designer. It's a very long career. We have in the back the black and white piece that she does in Florida in the 1930s. We have our only 40s piece right in the front, this fantastic day dress. The wedding gown from the from the 40s with the, from the 50s with the Bermuda lilies at the bodice because the bride's family had a connection to Bermuda. And then you have this great in the back, this kind of new look, Dior influenced evening gown in the back, which is so much that, full skirted, tight bodice look. And then this fantastic piece from the Met, the turquoise and black, looking at what she's designing in the 60s. And actually, this was modeled on the Mike Douglas show.
And it's featured in the Ebony magazine article, which was one of the models and a woman who worked with Lowe, Judith Geil, wore it that photo shoot.
It's pretty iconic. It made the cover of your catalog, is that right?
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And this room is entitled Debutante and Fantasy Gowns. They are fantastic.
And no two are the same. That was something that was very much a point of pride for Lowe, that no woman, she ever wanted them to have a gown that was the same as another gown. And so each one is different.
Yeah, particularly working in white for debutantes, the idea of making each dress unique, really giving each girl a chance to shine in that moment. Lowe really excelled at this, being able to really create unique pieces all in white. And you'll see that all three of these dresses are shown from the back. When you're dancing at a debutante ball, what you see is the back of a gown. And so she made a point of really making that the embellishment. And there's a great quote in one of the articles of the time where she said many of her dresses had low backs because she didn't want the young men getting them dirty.
Great. And we have three very fantastical pieces over here. And one can only guess, I guess, without knowing the backstory, their inspiration. But I know that everything here has a story, a well-researched story.
It does. So you're looking at 3 states, different balls. This was a big part of Lowe's business, was dressing whole courts or whole groupings of these balls. And in fact, it's larger scale commissions, really, that when her mother passes away, when she's a young girl, she's left to finish a big commission for this, a governor's event. And so that really becomes a staple of how she builds her business, particularly initially. Kim, do you want to talk about the specific pieces?
Yeah, so the dress that you see on the left here is a 20s dress. It's one of 2 from the 1920s we have. And this is when Lowe is working in Florida. And she actually got the commission to do the Gasparilla court gowns for several years, which was an amazing opportunity for her as a Black designer at the time. And one of the women at the time said, you know, if you weren't wearing a Gasparilla gown by Annie, you shouldn't even show up. So that was sort of the mentality and the appreciation for her work, even in the 1920s. The gown that you see in the back, the gorgeous salmon gown, is another one of the Axar Ben gowns. And it is, this particular commission was for over 30 dresses. And the people working on the Axar Ben ball, they actually came to New York and had her make these when she was working for Saks Fifth Avenue in the Adam Room. And so this is a countess gown for that occasion. The gown on the right, which is this beautifully sculptural gown with these grapes, it was made for an event in Missouri called the Veiled Prophet Ball. And it actually is an interesting story in the sense that while it looks beautiful and you know, we celebrate this dress, unfortunately, the organization itself had Confederate roots. Whether Lowe knew that or not, we don't know, but just a glimpse into the time and some of the associations of these groups that were holding these types of balls. Certainly balls that she would not have been invited to.
So, a substantial part of Lowe's, she dressed people kind of throughout the important moments of their life, from debutante coming out to balls, and then of course, probably your biggest stage would be your wedding. And there's an interesting selection of wedding gowns, and with probably one of her most famous.
Yes. So one of the challenges that we knew we were going to have to think about, strategizing about how to represent Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding gown. And that wedding gown is in the JFK Library. And unfortunately, it had been long on view, it has not survived well, it was in really poor condition. And we knew we weren't going to be able to borrow it for the exhibit. And we were very fortunate to be able to form essentially a partnership with the JFK Library. And they gave our textile conservator, Kate Salmo, who's the head of our textile lab, and Katia Rolsey, who's an instructor at University of Delaware, access to the original. And Katia, with Kate's help, but Katia taking the lead, made all these detailed drawings over the course of several days. It took all these photographs and then came back to her studio. And I know you had a discussion with Katia about the creation of this gown, but we are the first institution that the JFK Library has ever allowed to reproduce it. And although it had been reproduced in paper, it had never been accurately reproduced in textiles. So it's become one of the really significant pieces in the show. We also, through Katia, were able to have students from the University of Delaware work on the piece, which was just a revelation for them to have to undertake something. They said it took them at least 50 hours to do just the rosettes. So they really had their their hand in the creation of it, and I think it was an experience they'll never forget, really.
I'm sure.
And Couturier herself, this was getting to know Ann Lowe with an intimacy that only through trying to reproduce her pieces, I think, could she ever really have experienced that kind of familiarity with her hand in the making of her pieces.
Yeah, it's certainly one thing to study a designer and their techniques through a book, a completely other thing to study them through a garment, and a singular garment at that.
It's been really interesting because I think, and I know that probably she talked about this, we all talk about it, but that Jacqueline Kennedy, it's said, didn't like this wedding gown. This was a gown, like a lot of gowns where wedding gowns aren't necessarily the bride's choice. There's a lot of other voices influencing the gown. And we certainly see her style after this, after she is married, becoming much more streamlined. But for so many people looking at this gown, even our visitors will say it's one of the most beautiful gowns they've ever seen. And it really is a tour de force of craftsmanship. And of course, Ann Lowe had to remake this gown as well as any number from the wedding party because of a pipe bursting in her studio shortly before she was due to deliver the gown. So it's a much larger story.
Yeah. It will be published someday, I'm sure.
Oh, well, I don't know that we'll ever know the truth.
That's true.
We do know that Ann Lowe was not acknowledged by Jacqueline Kennedy as the maker. But we'll never really know all the details, I think, of that story.
Sure. What's the next piece we're going to be looking at?
I think we're going to look at Bella Copeland, one of our local pieces. And Kim, would you like to talk about it?
Sure. So this dress is in the collection of the Delaware Historical Society, and Ann Bella Copeland, who was a DuPont, wore this dress in 1964. So it's pretty late in Lowe's career. I think what's most notable is how different it is from most of what you see in the gallery. And Ann worked in the fashion business in New York, and so when she went to Lowe to have this dress made, she actually requested that it be something very simple and unembellished. She was aware of the styles at the time that were sleeker, and that's what she wanted in a dress. And I think this really shows us how Lowe is making to her individual clients with what they want in mind. And she particularly wanted this very long, sophisticated train. And of course, the fact that it attaches at the shoulder really makes it special.
Awesome.
This is a particularly fun grouping. This is a wedding dress from 1968. And it is one of the few clients that Lowe had who was a young African-American woman. Her father was a distinguished doctor and church member in the DC community. And this particular dress is the latest dress in the exhibition. It's from 1968. It uses a technique that Lowe often used called fussy cutting, where elements of the lace are actually cut out and then attached separately, as you can see on the train and the dress. And Liz talks about this dress all the time in terms of its sort of moment in the 1960s, this sort of flower power kind of aesthetic of it. It's traditional in one sense, but also has this sort of fun, flowery aspect of its time.
And then we were so lucky because we were able to get the two gowns that were also worn by members of the bridal party. And at the opening, the Mance family actually came, although Elizabeth Mance wasn't able to come to wear the wedding gown, but there were other members of the family who had great memories of the wedding, but particularly of actually meeting Ann Lowe and their fittings, how impressive it all was to feel that there were these custom gowns being made for them. And one really poignant detail is that the bride's father passed away a little over a month after the wedding. And so for the family, it's also very poignant to see the gown displayed again. And I think that's been a really beautiful part of this exhibit is that so many of the wearers, including wearers of the Axar Ben gowns that we've looked at, members of the Lee family who employed Ann Lowe early in her career in Florida, they all have been converging on the show. And so in these garments, there are all kinds of intense personal memories that they're awakening in people, and particularly for the Mance family to all be here at the opening was a really special moment for all of us.
Yeah. And Lowe actually attended this wedding too, so she did have a presence at this wedding and met the family.
She's even in the photo of Elizabeth Mance walking into the church, which is really nice.
And one of the women we met, and I'm really excited, she's supposed to share some pictures with me, but she was the flower girl, and Lowe made her dress as well. So the dress doesn't survive, but she has some photos.
We have a question about this. What is the name of the technique you spoke about, of the hand cutting of the lace? And what was the woman's name?
The bride's name was Elizabeth Mance, and the technique I mentioned is called fussy cutting.
And that's one of the signatures of many Lowe pieces, really for decades, is this very refined cutting of elements out of lace, but also out of even fabric too, and then applying these elements. And I think one of the things that really strikes a lot of the people who come who have a design background is how specifically everything is placed. So all of these cut out and then applique pieces really, it's the kind of the essence of couture. They're placed in positions that are going to flatter the wearer and also ensure that the gown from every angle is going to be exquisite and sculptural. And she really achieves that.
And the rest of these garments all kind of show that as well, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, this deck really looks at construction, and so most of these dresses are attributed. There's at least one that's not, but here we really look at the construction of a dress, which if you look inside of an Ann Lowe gown, that's one of the telltale signs is how the bodice is constructed, but also the techniques of applying flowers and leaves. The blue dress that you see here on the left, for instance, that's actually another dress that belonged to Elizabeth Mance. You do see fussy cutting on that dress. And you also see what Alexandra was talking about with very careful placement of elements. The bow on that dress is positioned to one side because Elizabeth Mance was a pianist and sitting on the piano bench. It was designed in such a way that that element could be seen by the audience and really appreciated, but she could sit comfortably.
Very smart.
So on this platform, one of the really important pieces is actually on loan to us from the Hillwood Museum, and it's a gown associated with Marjorie Merriweather Post. This is the gown that Margaret Powell, when she was getting her master's degree at the Smithsonian, saw at Hillwood, and it really becomes this I think, kind of revelation to her that a Black designer had made or is credited with making this. There's some unusual construction details in this, so the attribution to Lowe is supposed. We know that Marjorie Merriweather Post was a big client of Ann Lowe's, and she even had her portrait painted in the gown. So it's an important part of the story because it really in some ways is the origin story for Margaret that begins her lifelong interest in discovering this designer that she'd never heard of.
I think you can see similarities to the Jackie Kennedy wedding dress in this dress with the techniques of the swirls in it. It's hypothesized that the dress is a little bit different than other Lowe dresses because it was made very quickly. The painter that was doing the portrait was dying when he was painting it. So there are elements of the dress that are unfinished. It appears to have been altered at some point, probably to fit a sitter that was in place for the portrait in Marjorie Merriweather post absence.
Anything else in this display, or should we move on to the next?
No, it's just I think as we walk by, I love to call out the velvet dress or gown that's probably about 1955. Because when you look at it, it's so simple. It doesn't read like a Lowe, but to Kim's point, and I think this is something really important, is that really understanding these features of the gown on the inside are this important clue to attribution with Ann Lowe. But also, for those of you who know Charles James.
Sure.
I mean, to me, this absolutely competes with a Charles James, if not exceeds it, in its construction, in its simplicity, and it just shows, I think, the breadth of what she can do from heavily embellished pieces to much more simple construction.
Great. Oh, a big pop of color.
Yes.
Yes, this is another case that looks at a timeline, starting again in the 1920s and going through the late 60s. But here, the interpretation is really focusing on Lowe as a businesswoman and the labels that she worked under. And so we see here some of those different companies and ways that she's working over time, including a couple businesses of her own. She did have her own label at different times in her life, but she was not a particularly savvy businesswoman, and unfortunately never had a business for very long. The longest portion and most stable part of her career was when her son was actually working for her and keeping her books, but when he was killed in a car accident, that sort of ended that portion. So I don't know if you want to start with the 1920s.
This is our second. Kim had mentioned there are two 20s pieces in the show. This is another Gasparilla Queen gown, and keep in mind this is all hand beaded for the time. This particular piece is pretty heavily conserved. It was pretty heavily conserved before it came to be lent to us. So it would have been a little more fluid, but I think it gives you a sense of the range of that sort of couture atelier level skills that were being employed in Lowe's early career.
And it's an important time of her career, I think, too, because she's actually training other African American women in the community to do this work. And there are even women after Lowe leaves Florida who advertise as having learned from her and worked with her. So she very much was building up that community and that those skill sets. So, I mean, we certainly could talk about every dress in here, but I think one of the particularly interesting ones is the feather dress, which is one that was worn for a fashion show. Actually, it was worn by a model for a fashion show. And this was in a period of her career where she was working for a company called Madeleine Couture. And she had actually applied for Madeleine Couture in the 1920s when she first went to New York. At the time, they didn't have a position for her. And when she lost her business later in life, she went back to Madeleine Couture. At that point, it was owned by a woman and a man, Ione and Benjamin Stoddard. They were the son and daughter-in-law of the original owner she had gone to. And they said, sure, they wanted to take Lowe on. They knew her well, they knew her client list. And they actually kind of transitioned their clientele and reworked their business to focus on more of these debutante and bridal kinds of clients. But the really great thing for working with Lowe, that they did for her was they actually were behind a lot of the press. It was the Stoddards and Madame Couture who got her this fashion show where this dress appeared, which is just, I'll say, is a real kudos to our conservation labs for the work that they did to recreate this dress. I think they talked about that some in one of the other episodes.
Yeah, the feathers, for being brand new, they certainly look of the period. They did a really great job of maintaining the integrity of a dress of many decades old. It doesn't pop out to you like, oh, that was been replaced.
Yeah. And so the Stoddards got her on the Mike Douglas show in the 1960s. They orchestrated the Saturday Evening Post article and really gave Lowe the opportunity to have her own voice later in her career. It's on the Mike Douglas show and in those articles that she really lays claim to the Jackie Kennedy dress, to the dress that Olivia de Havilland wore to the Oscars in 1947. So really giving her this voice and that important recognition.
Amazing. So this vignette is talking about fabrics and beading techniques inspired by woven fabrics. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And also just her ability to follow the trends too. And with Jacqueline Kennedy's as her kind of iconic trip to India, you get this in the 60s. You get this revival or interest in all these Indian fabrics that women are bringing home. In the turquoise gown, you actually see a woman bringing it back from a trip to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And that's represented in the salvage of that gown. And so she has clients who are bringing her fabric, and then she's envisioning designs to interpret that. So she is very sensitive to what is going on in fashion, even though her pieces are remarkably timeless. Another piece that's worn on the Mike Douglas show is this amazing coat that was probably modeled over a gown. But just, when you think about this period of the 60s and looking at Moroccan inspiration and these different shapes, you can really see Lowe picking up on that in her designs. But then again, just adding these beautiful techniques of beading and embellishment that are so signature Lowe that I think really distinguish this and elevate it to that couture level. But just to piggyback on the discussion of the fussy cutting, that is really so evident in the artistry she uses when she is taking this Indian fabric and cutting it in very subtle ways and applying it or utilizing the shapes in the pattern and cutting them out so that you have almost this fringing at the bottom of the bodice. And I mean, her sensitivity to whatever fabric she was using and creating that into a design that will showcase it, I think is really on display in this case.
Let's get a close-up of that fringe because I think the camera cut out for a second. So there you can see the fringe at the bottom of the empire waist, cut in a feather or leaf motif that really, you're right, it's fussy cut of the brocade work in the fabric.
And you also see it on this incredible piece from the 30s where she's fussy cut that back detail and then the edging of that peplum, the edging of the skirt, so it doesn't really read obviously that you're seeing that technique, but that's all sort of this subtle artistry that she's bringing to the designs.
A couple of questions that I think you addressed well, asking that, these are all on loan from different public and private institutions, and your work and Elizabeth Way kind of sought them out, but starting off with the initial research.
By Margaret.
By Margaret.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, so Margaret had already identified many of them, and then Liz continued to find some additional ones, and really, we are still finding them. The exhibition has given us amazing opportunities to identify some new ones. So we have an email, and we've asked people to reach out to us at lowresearch@wintherthur.org if they know of any Lowe gowns, images of Lowe gowns, any stories they might have. But we've already come up with 6 or 7 new gowns and stories since doing this research and launching the exhibition.
And that's almost 10% of the known Lowe dresses, is that right? There was only 60 or 70?
I think there are probably more.
More.
There are quite a number in the Met's collection and at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Okay.
But it's wonderful to even find one. And,
Yeah.
one of them actually has been donated to FIT as a result of us becoming aware of it. And so I think there'll be more stories like that.
And one walked into Ms. Melena's vintage shop in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and she pulled it out of the bag that it was brought in and just immediately knew by feeling it that this was something special. But then I think we've really tuned people into Ann Lowe in a totally different way. And so as she starts looking at it, she realizes, this is a Lowe, it's labeled. And so I think this show, I like to think of it, this is the show, but this is not the last show.
Sure.
That is going to look at Lowe. And in fact, now with the number of gowns that are turning up, hopefully there'll be a show after this, not necessarily at Wintherthur, but at another institution that has a whole new group of Lowe gowns.
Yeah, that's pretty wonderful. Okay. Yeah, sorry. You can continue. I'm going to get out of the chat. So this is kind of the crescendo moment, right? This is tying Lowe's work and her influence to some contemporary Black American designers.
Yes. Who really, in a lot of ways, many of them have spoken really in moving ways about looking at Lowe's story and seeing her as breaking barriers that have benefited them in their careers. And also one thing we wanted is to have a range of very well-established designers like B. Michael or Tracy Reese, but then also have more emerging designers, and including things like Bishmi Cromartie, who on the Thursday night of our director's reception for this exhibition, he won Project Runway All-Stars.
That's so cool.
And so he's not as emerging as he was when we included him, but also just showing the influence of Black designers on things like wedding gowns today. We have this magnificent gown by Amsal. She was one of the first to pioneer the more minimalistic wedding gowns. And, still highly embellished, but much more comfortable to wear. But even though she has passed away, her label continues, which is a very unusual phenomena associated with that business. Do you want to talk a little bit about B. Michael?
Sure. So B. Michael, we have 3 pieces here. The short black and gold dress, the black dress with the red detail in the back, and then this gold dress in the front, which I think is a real showstopper, and it's very meaningful as well. So Liz chose each of the contemporary designers for a different way that they connect to Lowe's story. And B. Michael she chose because he is really working in this true Couturier way, much like Lowe is. This particular dress, the gold dress, was made for Dawn Davis to wear to the Met Gala in 2021, I believe. And it's really significant because the hem line of the dress has Ann Lowe's name embroidered on it, as well as the name of other Black designers. And Dawn Davis wanted to carry these designers with her to the Met Gala that year, and really to give them the opportunity to have the presence there. So we also see Elizabeth Keckley up front here. B. Michael's name is on there. Patrick Kelly, I think, and some other names as well.
And then we kind of end with real Dazzler, two pieces worn by Bevy Smith, also worn to the Met Gala in 2019, the cape by Dapper Dan, and the gown by Kimberly Goldson. It turned out that after she got the cape, she actually had Kimberly embellish the Dapper Dan. It's written 4 times on the back of the cape, and she had Kimberly embellish that with some extra sparkle. Bevy was here at the director's reception, and she did an incredible filming of her getting ready for the gala. And when she was talking about it, she said, you know, everyone sees people on the red carpet, but they don't realize all the people behind the scenes who are making that happen. And she, in a lot of ways, started a trend of raising awareness of all the people who are creating the looks, from the designers to the makeup artists and so many others who are creating these moments for people that people just see on the red carpet but don't necessarily know all the invisible people that are involved in making them happen.
And I love that this dress has the feathers on the sleeves. That was a surprise to us because we'd only seen pictures of it with the cape on. So when it arrived and it had those feathers, which are very reminiscent of the feathers, at least color-wise, on the other dress, it was kind of a lot of fun.
Can they talk about using headless and armless mannequins?
So that was a curatorial choice, for sure. And then actually the forms we're using were a really important part of the project. We partnered with the University of Delaware's Maker Gym to actually create these custom conservation-safe forms that are based on several size avatars that Couturier was involved with, who's also the maker of the Jacqueline Kennedy wedding gown. And these forms still had to be customized a bit after they were created. They're made out of a conservation-safe ethafoam.
Yeah. So dressing mannequins, particularly for historic pieces, is really important when you think about clothes are meant to be worn for short periods of time. But in an exhibition like this, these garments will be on the mannequins for nearly 4 months. You can imagine what that could do to a dress, particularly dresses that are heavily embellished. So the mannequin really plays a very, very important role in supporting the pieces and making sure that we maintain them and preserve them. So we always want to use materials that are safe, and so having the ethafoam mannequins was important. And in the past, we've hand-carved our ethafoam mannequins, which is incredibly time-consuming. So this project that Alexandra was telling you about with the Maker Gym, we constructed these mannequins in a much more timely fashion using a CNC router. And it's actually a project that our conservators are going to be talking about in a lot more detail, so that hopefully other museums will have the opportunity to replicate the process.
Liz Way, we spent a lot of time talking about what would the mannequins look like. And so these are reminiscent of dress forms, the kind of dress forms that Ann Lowe probably would have used. We were very specific about picking a tone of gray, so not having anything that was particularly associated with a skin color, and then only when necessary having any kind of shoulder support or caps, just to really let the garments just be the primary focus. And we had there was no head pieces associated with it, so no heads for the forms, but actually we have a unique neck cap. For those of you who've ever worked with forms, neck caps can be a big issue, and one of our former preparators, exhibition preparators, designed a very specific type of neck cap to be used with these ethafoam forms that were being created.
One piece that was mentioned in our talk with the conservators, and if you want to learn more and see the process making the dress forms, please watch part 2 of our 3-part series, was the consideration of the color of the form and how it would photograph in the catalog. So it almost just disappears. And speaking of this catalog, it is published by Rizzoli. If you come to the show, you can buy it in the store here or purchase it online.
And if you come to the symposium, you can buy it here and have Leslie sign it.
Yeah, and Alexandra and Kim. That was wonderful, ladies. Thank you so much for the tour. Let's move to some questions and answers because the chat box runneth over. Any plans for touring or loaning the exhibit to other institutions?
We would have loved to, but given the nature of the loans, particularly the institutional loans, having them on view for 4 months, they could not travel and be on view any longer. So we certainly hope that some of the private individuals we've identified would consider lending to another show, but we weren't able to travel this exhibit.
Sure. Like you said, there will be. This is almost Lowe's coming out, her debutante ball of the 21st century.
I hope so.
So, maybe she'll get her marriage and her costume ball next,
Yes,
and then
and her fantasy
red
ball,
her red
yes.
carpet moment, and maybe her own Met Gala someday, or Costume Institute show. Well, I would, on behalf of CSA, like to thank Kim and Alexandra and the whole team at Wintherthur for letting us in behind the scenes, off hours, staying late, and really letting CSA get a glimpse that nobody else has. You've seen articles in Vogue recently, Wall Street Journal coming out. Everyone is talking about this show, but this is something unique and special for CSA. And on behalf of CSA, I'd also like to thank the audience for tuning in for all 3 series. And if you did miss an episode, they are available on our YouTube page. Thank you again, ladies.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you.
Thank you.